seriously?
What makes a swear word a swear word?
It's like any other aspect of meaning. There's nothing special about fuck that makes it taboo. There's something attached to that string of words that we've arbitrarily decided is bad.
Since we're kind of already talking about fuck, how does something become a swear word?
So the genesis is really hard to figure out sometimes. Um, Fuck is an interesting one. It's really, really old. We can date it back to Proto-Indo-European. So the language that goes way, way back to, prehistory. There's speculation about what it would have meant. My favorite is that it meant something along the lines of prick, right? Like pricking your finger with a needle. There's others who say that it meant something like strike. And it doesn't really matter. What that tells me is that it was a euphemism, that there was probably a word for sex at the time that was tabooed enough that they used a metaphoric way of talking about it. And then there's what we call the euphemism treadmill, where you invent a euphemism, eventually it becomes too attached to that taboo thing that you're talking about. And at that point, it becomes taboo. So you replaced a taboo with this word, and then eventually it becomes taboo itself.
So that's usually how they come about, is that we invent these words kind of as a way to talk about something we shouldn't be talking about. Then the word itself becomes the thing that we shouldn't say.
Yeah.
Is there something that you would say when we look at like the big cuss words? The big cuss words to my mind are fuck, shit, bitch, etc. Do they seem to have things in common?
In general, we can pick out about 7 fields of meaning bad words, taboo words come from. Obscenity, that's one that we see cropping up in language after language. So anything having to do with sex. Scatology is another one. So anything having to do with stuff coming out of our bodies, we tend to taboo. The one exception to that is tears. There's nobody's been able to find a word in any language that's a taboo word for tears. Profanity. So anything having to do with religion, that's a very common place to draw taboo words from. There's some that may be less common for English, like death. We can point to a few. 1980s, people didn't like saying the word AIDS. It was a taboo thing to even say the word, and there was a big campaign where they put on billboards in big letters AIDS, and that was a political statement, and that taboo gradually went away. Go back to Shakespeare's time, and words like pox and plague were somewhat taboo, but if some years before that they would have been highly taboo because they had to do with death. So you see in Shakespeare's time, he would use plaguey sort of in the same way that we would use shitty. There's also going to be words relating to animals. Not so common in more sort of civilized times because we're not as scared of animals as we used to. But if you imagine back when, we were right on the cusp of wilderness, something like a wolf would be terrifying. And so you didn't say the name because it might invite it to come into your village. And so you can see, historically we have euphemisms that we've inherited. So in Hungarian, the word for wolf is farkas, which just means, the one with a tail. In English, if you look, historically, and in most Germanic languages, the word for bear derives from brown. So it's the brown one. In Slavic languages, the word for bear derives from honey eater. So we had all these ways to avoid saying the name of this animal because we, through, sort of a word magic, we didn't want to invite them into our lives.
So would somebody thousands of years ago say along the lines of like where I would say, oh shit, they would be like, oh tiger?
Probably. It's hard. It's hard for me to figure out exactly how it was done at that time. There's not many languages today that seem to have that same taboo. So I found very little research explaining it. Um, you will find sometimes examples where somebody will say the word and then kind of do some sort of ritual practice to um, ward off the evil, like they might spit or something like that. We see naming will also be taboo, so certain names we don't say. That's one of the things I like about Harry Potter books is that you've got that character Voldemort that nobody's supposed to say his name. There's something right about that. We find that in language after language that there are certain names that you're not supposed to say.
Looking at the list of swear words, there seems to be hundreds of them. What would you say are the worst ones?
Today, the N-word is up there at the top, and it has been for the last several decades. The F slur has moved up. So I've been teaching a course on taboo words since 2006. So it's been 2 decades. And during that time, the F slur has gotten much, much worse. And so my students, I do a survey with my students every semester, and it's gradually climbed the ranks. The C word has, we can say that one, can't we now?
That's one that, like, I think that we can say. It's just
funny. 10 years ago, people would have been really mad at me for saying it. Cunt has gone down. And so it's still bad, but it's not as bad. Let's see. Some of the ones my students object to, beaner for Hispanic people. Students tell me that one's pretty bad. It's funny from my perspective, being as old as I am, it doesn't resonate with me the same way, but my students tell me it's, that if you're Hispanic, if you're Latino, you can say it, but if you're not, you shouldn't. The whore is still up there. Cocksucker. Motherfucker is fairly bad, not terrible. There's one I'm missing. Fuck is not all that high anymore. It used to be really high, but it's, for my students, it's comes in right in the middle, I would say, maybe a top middle, but it's not anywhere near what some of those others. And the interesting thing to me is all of the ones at the top today are slurs. If you go back, like thinking about mid 20th century, all of the really bad ones were sexual. They were obscenity. And that started probably in the Victorian age, late Victorian age, that obscenity became the worst one. Before that, it would have been blasphemy, or not blasphemy, sorry, profanity. So words related to religion would have been the top. So hell was used in the 19th century somewhat in the same way that we use, fuck. But it would have been more powerful than fuck is today.
Yeah, it seems like the religious ones have kind of fallen off.
In some parts of our society, in certain different cultures. Yeah, and in different cultures, it's going to be stronger. I would hazard that in certain parts of the Middle East, say in Islam, in Muslim countries, I would think that you're going to find a lot of taboo words related to religion. And those are probably going to be some of the strongest ones.
I don't know how much you might know about this, but when you look at other languages, other countries, do they seem to have the same language taboos that we do in regards to swear words?
So, yeah, going back to like those 7 classes of taboo words, that seems to be cross-linguistic. It doesn't mean there aren't exceptions to that, but those seem to be the areas that we draw taboo words from cross-linguistically. But different languages, different cultures are going to draw from different classes as being their most taboo. I've had Japanese students who tell me that death is one of the biggest taboos in Japanese. So the word, I think it's pronounced shine, to die, is one of the worst things you can say to somebody. So yes, you're going to get the same classes, but different cultures will put different emphases on different ones.
Are you ready for some harder slash listener submitted questions about swear words?
Sure.
What is your personal favorite?
I love that question. Um, the one I always go to is, it's not common today, but I love it, is shitabed, which is a slur for, it's a 17th century slur, that basically means this person is so slovenly or so drunk that they shit their bed when they go to sleep. And there's just something about that image I think is beautiful. And it's a good slur because it doesn't demean any particular group of people. It just demeans that person. So that's my favorite.
That was our next question. Is like favorite historical one. Are there other historical ones that you think like, oh, those are pretty good or unique? Are there other ones that jump out at you or like those were kind of interesting ones from history?
There's some other ones it's not a particular word, but I find the word cunt fascinating because, again, this is a really old word and there's no good explanation that I know of that tells us where it came from. We know that like in early anatomical drawings for doctors, they had things labeled with cunt. So it wasn't a terrible word. And there's a really old map of London that had a street called Gropa Kuntalana, which basically means, Grope Cunt Lane. And that, not surprisingly, is where the prostitutes were. So I would guess that wasn't a good word, but it wasn't as terrible. It's hard to imagine having a city name today called Grope Cunt Lane.
I can't get myself to say that one because the C
Yeah.
word to me is still like, if I'm out in public and I hear somebody say fuck or shit, I don't bat an eye. If I hear
Right.
somebody say cunt, I'm like, oh man. Besides the slurs, the racial slurs and the homophobic slurs, that to me is like, oh, you don't say that one.
I agree. I mean, I'm a bit older than you, but yes. But my students, they don't seem that upset about it anymore. In the UK and in Australia, for a while, it's not been that bad.
One of the ones you said that was one of the seven big ones that was surprising to me was whore.
Yeah,
That was a word that was, when I was growing up, like that wasn't a big deal at all.
yeah. I'm surprised by that one too. I haven't queried my students on that, but yeah, it's been pretty consistent that that's up there. My guess is that it's considered somehow judgmental, that it's because it's not what's the word, sex positive, that it's judging a woman based on her sexual activity in a way that's a double standard. And I think that's my best explanation for why my students find that one objectionable.
That was the first thing that I went to is like, oh, it's the double standard of it, right? Like there is no word for male whore. I mean, I'm sure that there is, but like it's not in practicality.
Yeah, and I've had students say that when we talked about slut, for example, women say that they find it quite offensive if especially if a man called them a slut. And I say, okay, well, occasionally it gets applied to men, and I go to the men, how would you feel if a woman called you a slut? And their response across the board is, oh, I'd find that a compliment.
Right.
So, even today, as much as we'd like to think that we have progressed beyond it, there's a double standard. There absolutely is. When you look at the slurs for women compared to men, there's just more of them for women, and they're more taboo. The slurs for men, the only one that's male specific that's highly taboo is the F word, the F slur.
Swear word that has most lost its meaning.
I would say I would have to say fuck. It's certainly it's used sexually today, but it's so infrequent compared to how often we use it just as emphatic. We use it so often just to to, in the same way that we might use very, to add emotion. Very doesn't add much emotion, but it's just an emotive today. Most of the time that it gets used, or it's an exclamation. Using it to actually mean sex gets used, but it's not as common. So we've bleached that of a lot of its meaning. Hell would be similar. We don't use it as often or that frequently to refer to the netherworld. It's mostly just a word that has some emotional power. It's really, really low on tabooness today. My students rank it slightly higher than our controls. So I use like a word like green as a control, and hell is only slightly more taboo than green.
Where does damn sit in that? Is that still
Pretty
considered
low.
to be a cuss word or not really anymore?
I mean, my students rank it slightly higher than control, so I would say, yeah, it's very slightly taboo today.
Are there any swear words that have become normal words?
I'll give you one that I love. Um, there's the word occupy, which we don't think anything of it today, right?
Not at all.
There was a period of I think it was about 200 years. So occupy was a euphemism originally. It meant what it means today. And then it became a euphemism for sex. And that became really prominent for the word, So occupy stopped being used for anything but sex. And it became taboo enough that people stopped using it altogether. And it just kind of fell out of use. And then at some point, some scholar must have seen it written somewhere in an old book and thought, oh, that's a cool word. I'm going to start using that word. And it came back into use. And so today we don't think anything of it, but it was bad enough, apparently, that people stopped using it. So anyways, I find that one really fascinating that happened.
So occupy used to be like fuck?
Something like that. I don't know how it was used exactly. All we know is that there was about a 200-year span that it just wasn't used, and we know that it was a euphemism at one point.
Are there any other ones you can think of off the top of your head that are like that? Like words that were swear words and now then they just became completely normal?
I mean, plague. Plague would be a good one.
Yeah.
Because there was a time that was really bad. So like if you think about when, and I forget which character says that in Romeo and Juliet, a plague on both your houses. Um, at the time that the play was written, that wouldn't have been too bad. That would have been something like damn you. But when the play was supposed to take place, that would have been a really bad thing to say. That would be, basically condemning a person's family to dying. And that would have been pretty taboo because plague was a real worry at the time. There's a few others that we find kind of funny today, like ye gads. Um, that would have been bad at some point, bad enough that it was censored in writing. It was originally a euphemism for you gods or ye gods, and then you put an A in it to make it no longer bad, so ye gads instead of ye gods.
Are there new cuss words? Are there new swear words that are popping up?
Where we are right now, as we've talked about, slurs are the worst words. My sense is that that's going to change. It's been that way long enough that kids are going to have to find a new way of shocking their parents. And right now, I think it's that saying slur words is going to shock people of our generation, my generation. I don't want to speak for your generation. But I think over time, then that means those words are going to become less taboo.
Has there ever been a word that was so bad that nobody would say it?
It's hard to imagine because the temptation to break taboos is too high, right? We all have that impulse in us to break taboos. Some of us can perhaps constrain it better than others. But I think that impulse is in us, and there's something satisfying about breaking taboos, which again gets to that emotional outlet of them. That we need those words because we need a way to verbalize the emotions. And so, there may be words that will fall out of use, but words that nobody ever says, I think that's rare that happens.